All right. Alrighty.
Okay.
That's a very slightly better field of view, but not much. Yeah. Alrighty. So, I made some notes earlier on. Basically, there are 7 points that I think we should cover, so that you guys have a complete sort of fundamental model here. So I'll send you this sort of outline of this later on, and I'm just going to bang through the points and ask questions as they come up. Sound good?
Good. Yep.
All right. So let's talk about the first thing, which is why is the US government doing TIDES? Why is the DoD remotely interested in doing all this stuff? And I want to point to a couple of reasons for this. The first is that it's strategically important. There are something like 4 million refugees in Iraq, and the collapse of the Iraqi infrastructure plus the number of refugees in Iraq is almost certainly one of the feeding routes that's driving the insurgency. At the end of the day, if you've got 20% of the population are refugees and the rest can't get clean water to drink, you're going to wind up with a lot of annoyed people. If you have an infrastructure collapse at a state level, then you don't really have the same basis of jobs and employment and financial welfare, and people become poor and angry. It's sort of the inverse of the Irish miracle that, basically as the Irish economy boomed, subscription in the IRA collapsed. Because if you're a 21, 22-year-old guy who could either become a terrorist leader or run a pizza bakery, you kind of wind up doing something else with your time. And this is clear. We've got billions, if not trillions, of dollars going behind fighting a war, in which infrastructure is a critical component. So that's the strategic reason for this. Fundamentally, winning wars is not just about going over there and knocking the enemies out. As we saw in World War II, the reconstruction planning is a great deal of what it takes to stabilize peace. And the modern warfare environment is very much about getting back to peace as quickly as possible and making the peace stable. It's this is the SSTR picture. It's creating and maintaining stable peace with potentially relatively small amounts of fighting at the beginning of that process. If that makes sense. Could somebody move that coffee cup?
Yeah.
Thank you. The other coffee cup. Yeah, that one. Much better. All right. So, does that make sense? Any questions about that?
Yeah, no.
All right. So then there's the humanitarian thing, which is something like 20 million refugees globally, including internally displaced people. Most of those refugees are refugees for between 1 and 2 decades. So, and there are exceptions to that. You have refugee camps in Africa, like, I'm trying to remember the name of the place. I think it's in... No, I'm not going to get the name. Which is working on like its 5th generation, and it's something like 500,000 people. They've just been there forever. The thing is, functionally speaking, it's a city. And there's just a lot of that stuff. And again, from a sort of strategic perspective, particularly for Africa Command, any time that you're going to be doing fighting in Africa, you're almost certainly going to have enormous numbers of displaced people, many of whom were already incredibly poor and vulnerable, and now things are even worse. So, you can imagine that if you had another sort of Rwandan genocide situation 5 years after Africa Command was fully stood up, you could easily wind up with 2 or 3 million refugees that were now under Africa Command's mandate. You go in, you make peace, all of the people that you're managing are now your problem. There's no government functioning at that point, both sides have withdrawn. The UN is potentially not going to turn up at that point. What do? So there's a need there to be able to integrate humanitarian operations at a much higher level. Any questions?
No.
All right. So finally, there's the domestic instance. As we saw with Katrina, it's not that difficult to wind up with a couple of 100,000 Americans homeless. Just off the top of my head, pandemic flu, the Bay quake, something like nuclear terrorism, all of these could easily wind up with, hundreds of thousands to 5 or 10 million stray people without any place to go. And in those kind of scenarios, FEMA was completely overwhelmed by a relatively small, predictable event. There were days of warning, and everybody understood the threat model because the Army Corps of Engineers had been down there building dikes for generations. So, in a really severe scenario, and what we've sort of taken to call catastrophes, the ability to do things like rehouse 5 million Americans, half of whom might have nuclear contamination issues, that's a pretty high bar. To get capability that you can actually do something sensible in that situation is going to require the development of some new techniques and new technologies. And those scenarios are fundamentally why the global war on terror is being fought. It's not about somebody banging an airline into a building. It's about somebody taking out New York with a suitcase they bought from some dodgy Russian in Azerbaijan. It's not about these kind of small scale incidents. It's about the very small risk of really serious incidents. And that's not to belittle the loss of life in small scale terrorism, but small scale terrorism is a completely different threat model from big scale terrorism. There's just no comparison between the cultural impact and the loss of life involved in WMD terrorism compared to even very effective conventional terrorism. And most WMD terrorism is going to result in very large sudden displacements of US population. So what's the difference between an African refugee and a US refugee? Budget and expectations. Also climate to some degree. But fundamentally, once people are driven out of the cities because it's just not safe to be there, pandemic, flu, fallout, whatever it happens to be, once you're out of the cities, at the end of the day, it's people and dirt. And it's much the same wherever those people are and whatever the dirt is. It's the same basic human needs. So, cheerful, I know. And, it's not that we don't have credible things to say about dealing with 500,000 or 1 million or 5 million American refugees. Right? We have a great story about how to approach that problem, and if we had to do it tomorrow, it would work out okay. Right? So it's not that these things cannot be coped with, it's just that the ability to cope with them has not been absorbed by the institutions yet. And TIDES is part of changing that. So, any questions? There should be some about that.
No, I think we're with you on that.
Okay. I want to just put this into context for a second. One of the things that we're going to consistently find is that the current way of breaking down institutional reality into, Southcom, Northcom, domestic operations, FEMA versus, DOD, all of that stuff is, largely historical breakdown of the bureaucratic space. This stuff really has nothing to do with the actual problem domain. If you were going to break it down by capability, the same institutions that do domestic disaster response in America would also be the guys that we send to deal with something like the Pakistan earthquake. Right, and there's this fundamental, problem that we've broken the problem down by sort of geography rather than by capability. And a lot of the problems that we find in trying to get, concepts from TIDES absorbed is that people don't really quite understand that, the current breakdowns are not really oriented around solving the problem. They're oriented around solving yesterday's problem, and by the time you've got budgets allocated over a 5, 10, 15-year cycle, and you've got programs that have been passed down for 3 generations, it's extremely hard to turn the institution in a way that will allow you to actually face the problem of the day accurately. So there's this constant pressure to try and get new ideas into the old format, and that in itself is probably going to turn out to be the single hardest part of getting this stuff done. And I think that there's excellent evidence that that's turning out to be the case. The technology is not really all that difficult. The problem is getting people to actually learn how it works and do it in the field. So I don't really have any horses in that race. I'm fundamentally allergic to all forms of bureaucracy, but if you see this stuff happening, that's what's going on. All right, so let's go back to some more cheerful material again. 6 ways of dying. There are fundamentally 6 things that can kill you. You can be too hot, you can be too cold, you can be thirsty, you can be hungry, you can get a disease, or you can die from violence. 5 of those things are typically prevented by infrastructure. The first 5 are typically blocked by infrastructure to the maximum extent possible. We don't get too hot, we don't get too cold, we don't get thirsty, we don't get hungry, and we don't get diseases because we built machines that keep us away from those problems. Places like Minneapolis are fundamentally uninhabitable for 5 or 6 months of the year. You try and live in Minneapolis without infrastructure, you'll die immediately. Just without hesitation, you will freeze to death. And people regularly do when their infrastructure breaks down. Your car breaks down when you're driving from one place to another in a snowstorm in Minneapolis, and you freeze to death in 20 minutes. This fundamental infrastructure framework around us is like an extension of our capability to exist in the environment. We basically terraformed Earth using infrastructure to make places which are uninhabitable habitable, and to make population densities which are fundamentally impossible possible. If you look at a place like New York City, the only reason New York City is humanly possible is sanitation and constant, pumping in of clean water and electricity. Those processes stop, New York ceases to be inhabitable immediately, and cholera, diphtheria, all the rest of these kinds of problems would spring up immediately. And this is what's happened in Baghdad, right? The infrastructure has collapsed. The population density is unsupportable because now you've got things like waterborne diseases because you've just got too many people, essentially, putting waste into the same water table. It's very important to understand that the infrastructure is the difference between life and death in almost anywhere in the world. There are only a few places where you can comfortably live without infrastructure, and those places are typically, not able to support enormous population densities. So the fundamental goal of TIDES is to be able to protect people from the first 5 ways you can die. Too hot, too cold, thirsty, hungry, and disease. The first 2 of those are basically shelter. The third is water. The 4th is food supply logistics, which we don't touch, and cooking, which we do. And then disease is largely the water purification and some of the public health stuff. Additional services like lighting and all the rest of that kind of stuff are conveniences. They're very nice, they help with education, they make people feel much more at home, but fundamentally they're conveniences. ICT is critical because ICT is the glue that allows you to figure out how to deliver the services that keep people alive. It's very, very important, and we all know that already. But this is the fundamental underlying model. You're trying to put something between people and death from their environment. And the ICT is, not a critical part of that until you try and do it without any ICT. Nobody really understands what it contributes until it fails. And at that point you suddenly understand that the guys on the ground don't have the complete picture. And now they can't get anybody who does have it. And this is a perpetual crisis. The NGOs over and over and over again send people out, and people wind up making bad guesses because they can't find the right engineer. You can't get the water tested, so you feed it to people and discover it's a mess. So yeah, the ICT is very important, even though it's not immediately between people on one of these ways of dying. It is, the critical thing. It's a way of tapping into the global education database, which is, fundamentally why the West is the West and everywhere else is not. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of education, science, technology, engineering, research and investment. And the ICT connection allows people to tap that base even when locally they don't have any of those resources. Even if you can't send a plane right now, as long as you can send data, you can still get people access to $1 trillion worth of infrastructure and education. Alright, so I'm going to take a break for a second to breathe. Have a think about that, figure out whether you have questions.
Okay. Right. Dr. Wells has talked at least me through a lot of this stuff as well in the week and a half that I've been here.
Ah, good.
I've been catching up on the TIDES and all the websites and reading all the literature and posting there as well too. So.
Oh, good, excellent.
Right along with what you're saying.
We definitely need somebody to be kind of the content manager. I still don't know of a single web page we can go to that has links to all of the different places where TIDES pictures are online.
Something to address, I think, when we get back from Honduras, at least.
Yep.
If not sooner.
Well, take lots of pictures. Is one of you taking down a video camera?
Yeah, we have a couple of the RCA small wonder video cameras that are going to be going down this week under the mail.
Okay, cool.
Today or tomorrow, Good.
Alright, let me just move my notes down here and then we'll wade into the next bit. Alright, granularity of infrastructure. This is reasonably well written up in the sort of 40-page introduction to TIDES document. So I'm not going to go into this super deep, but basically the smaller the component is, the smaller the unit of service is, the more it's possible to basically pour infrastructure into an area pretty much like a liquid. You just have this, you have a bucket of stoves or a container of stoves. If it's one per household, you just hand them out. If it's something like electrical power and then you've got to have a distribution harness, then you wind up with all of this second order fragility because now you've got this service tree. You have this kind of tree structured connection and pattern of wires. And the trunk of that tree is extremely vulnerable, as are the major branches. So that's an example of a structure which is inherently fragile. And if you deploy infrastructure which has that kind of tree structure, where you've got a lump in the middle which generates the service and then a tree that spreads it out, the tree is inherently unguardable. It's inherently fragile, and if anybody wants to break it, it's just not very difficult and never will be. The authoritative write-up on that is a book called Brittle Power from 1982 by Amory Levins. And it addresses fragility in the US electrical infrastructure and it's just a roadmap of what happened in Iraq to the power systems. It's chapter and verse. You cannot do power infrastructure in that way. So this part of the sort of implicit context of the TIDES thing is that we're focused very much on fine-grained infrastructure. So we're mainly aiming at the household level, and once in a while we might be focused on the sort of municipal level, the town level. So the big distinction between household level infrastructure and town level infrastructure is in household level infrastructure you don't need a bureaucracy to do the administration, because you don't have different administrative units, different households sharing a resource. You don't need a bureaucracy to divide up how the resource is allocated. This becomes extremely important when you're dealing with situations where there's just an enormous amount of chaos. The ideal TIDES item is something where you give somebody a box they can figure out how to use it in the same way that most people can figure out how to use a hammer, and then they take it home and you don't hear from them again. I mean, that's the perfect TIDES solution. If we had something like that for every one of these basic human needs, we would be done. Because if we had, for example, cheap solar panels, so you could do power generation household by household, all of these problems that we have with grid fragility in Iraq just wouldn't be there. And similarly, if you imagine dealing with, a 500,000 person refugee camp, you don't really want to be in the position of trying to set up an electrical utility. If you have a single large generation station and then you run wires, are you going to do billing? How do you stop people using 5 times more power than their neighbours? I mean, it's just, it's this enormous can of worms. And this happens for things like standpipes. I've seen some pictures from refugee camps of a spiral of buckets going around a standpipe, and it takes something like 2.5 hours or 3 hours to wait in line all the way around this spiral until your bucket is at the top of the queue and you can actually get your water. And that's an example of allocating the resource based on people's tolerance for standing in the sun and boredom. And it's just dumb. Boredom is not, it's basically like turning people's entire lives into the DMV. Right? Because it's a fundamentally economic problem. In the West, we have very efficient services like Starbucks, because money changes hands, and if Starbucks was slow and they made you wait in line for 3 hours, they would be out of business. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of extremely smart people who, in every area of your life, attempt to optimize the way in which your services are delivered, so that you will buy from them and not from somebody else. And that's fundamentally why it's very easy to get through life in the West, because, for the most part, people are trying to do things in a way that makes you happy. The exception are the bureaucracies that you have to deal with where you have no other options, like your telephone companies, where, from their perspective, they can use bureaucracy and difficulty of dealing with them and forms and end-user agreements and all the rest of this stuff as a way of making you not use their services in a way which causes them to make less money. So, what I want to get at here is that the current approach to dealing with refugees and displaced people is entirely based around the convenience of the NGOs administering the aid. The NGOs are not in any way, shape or form accountable to the refugees, and they're also not accountable to any kind of really serious technical oversight. The only point of accountability that most NGOs have is the donor public, and the donor public are shown only a very small subset of what goes on, and the donor public are not experts and have no understanding of what the other options are. And this is why NGO aid practices have fundamentally not evolved in approximately 50 years. They figured out what they were doing shortly after World War II. They made one round of adjustments once they ran out of the hardware they got from the militaries, and nothing has changed since. And this is also what the Red Cross thinks. The Red Cross is acutely aware that they do not innovate and they do not absorb engineering risk. So where this ties back together is fine-grained infrastructure that gives high quality of life is not something that it's been in anybody's commercial interest to develop at this point. This is terra incognita. Nobody's been here. Because in the West, infrastructure is provided by Victorian hardware. Giant factories that produce services that spread out over a pipe and wire harness. And we've got billions and billions of dollars of sunk costs, not just in that infrastructure, but in the systems that allow you to build more infrastructure that looks just like that. It makes sense? If you want to build a sewage plant, it's going to be like all of the other sewage plants, and it's cheap to build a sewage plant which is just like all the others. If you want to build a new kind of sewage plant, you have to eat all the engineering costs. So in the West, we have a very high quality of life infrastructure system, but it's entirely led at a nation-state level and at a municipal level. It's entirely built at a town level for the most part. So the result is that when you get into areas where you don't have enough stability to deploy that kind of Victorian infrastructure, there's essentially no coherent work on how to deploy those same high-quality services using household granularity infrastructure. And there's not been a commercial case for doing this until relatively recently. And what commercial case there is the so-called off-the-grid community, which is all of these back-to-nature hippies, living in solar panels with electrical wells. And, it's a tiny market. There's not really any money in it. And as a result, nobody's really done serious research in making this stuff work. The reason that I think it's very important for TIDES to be doing this kind of research is all of the strategic reasons that were listed in the first part are very heavily influenced by high quality distributed infrastructure. It's not clear that a refugee camp is anything other than a temporary city, and if you expect refugees to manage in kind of horrendous conditions for 20 years, at the end of the day you're going to be left with a lot of pissed off people. You have to treat people right at every step of your interaction with them, or eventually, you wind up making enemies that we just don't need to be making. So don't think of the refugee thing and the disaster response thing as being separate from, for example, rebuilding the suburban infrastructure in Iraq. At the end of the day, all human beings want high quality services, and we can deliver those services for $50 or $100 per head if we get the research right. And that's not all that much more than is being spent by the refugee handling agencies like the UN now. And they're spending a significant amount of money on these people, they're just not solving any fundamental problems in the process. So, try and break away from the idea that it's about refugees or it's about, distributed infrastructure in a reconstruction context. Fundamentally, it's about filling human needs. Everybody wants high quality services. And the actual fundamental hardware that you need for, a building versus a tent versus a hexyurt, it's all the same human needs. The infrastructure package is not that different. The key is the granularity of the infrastructure, not the deployment context. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Good. I'm just checking my notes here. Oh, okay. So one thing here is, no model has the right blend of price, resilience, and speed. Right? Nobody has the problem, and the budget to develop engineering solutions of turn up, build infrastructure for 500,000 people, leave. And that capability is something that the US government really wants and really needs. And it applies at home in a domestic context for FEMA, it applies in places like Iraq, and it applies in the kinds of situations that AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM are, talking about dealing with. It's that same basic need. Show up, give people what they need to stay alive, leave. And, from my perspective, if FEMA was really well built and ready to do this kind of work, then an expeditionary FEMA is actually a lot closer to what we need than necessarily putting this stuff into a military context. But right now the military is the group that's furthest ahead in thinking about this, so in a military context it goes. Alright. So, any questions on that section? No? I must be being clearer than usual. Alright. So let's get back to the TIDES stuff. Right? We've broken the TIDES thing down into these 7 areas. Shelter, water, power, integrated cooking, lighting and heating and cooling and all the rest of that stuff, sanitation and ICT. So part of the reason that we have that specific breakdown is because it maps fairly closely to the pipe and wire architecture that provides the services you use already. The water system is the water system that you're used to. The sanitation system is a toilet. Integrated cooking is a stove, and it substitutes for your gas or your electrical. And cooking, heating, lighting or cooling, heating, and lighting is basically small appliances. So that breakdown is not necessarily fundamental to the problem in the same way that the sort of 6 ways to die is fundamental. But what it is fundamental to the way that Westerners think about solving the problem. And that's an important distinction. The TIDES model of these 7 infrastructures is not built in problem space. That TIDES model was built inside of Western mind space. Right? That's a way of having people think about substituting, the nice 110 volts that comes out of their wall socket for 4 AA batteries they recharge once a day. Well, that's your power service. That's what provides your light. So it's important to have this distinction between the sort of 6 ways to die level, which is extremely fundamental in general, and the breakdown into these 7 infrastructures, which is kind of specific to the way that we're thinking about solving these basic problems. You will eventually find places where the sort of whole systems thinking level puts a lot of pressure on this 7-way breakdown. You'll find situations where a single piece of equipment is actually serving a broader set of needs than would immediately be thought of in that breakdown. And those kind of systems, we need to make sure they're modeled correctly, because those are really important. The systems which span and provide many services in a single system are very, very valuable, because they tend to be much more efficient than the systems which are broken down one at a time. Let's sort of just run over the infrastructures for a minute. Shelter. You've built hexyurts. You know what they look like. You've put up tents. You've put up unifolds. You've put up domes. I think one person at least has done each one of those things.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as far as possible, try and cross-train on the shelters. Learn what they're like to put up and take down. Try and spend a week or 2 living in them. I mean, that might sound kind of dumb, but until you've lived in one of these insulation hexyurts and you can compare it to living in one of these brown hexyurts, you won't really understand why the brown hexyurt is not something you're going to want to live in for so long. The fact is, the silver exterior and an R value of 6.5 makes an enormous difference to your quality of life. And one of the fundamental things, at least from the hexyurt project, is we use our own gear. I've lived in hexyurts for an extended period of time. I've cooked on the stove. I've lit my house with the light. And, those kinds of systems, unless you actually live in them for a while and use them day in, day out, you don't really build a full internal model of why one system is good and another system is bad. So I don't know how you fit this into your schedules, but at some point, maybe you guys all, put the shelters up somewhere that's a 5-mile drive from NDU, and everybody just has, a 2-week camp out, and you live like refugees for a while and you rotate through the shelters, document everything possible on video, write up notes, and, go to work and go to school as you do now. But when you go home, go back to your refugee camp. Without doing that kind of stuff, it's very, very easy to assume that 2 solutions which look kind of similar are similar, when in fact they work in completely different ways and have completely different performance characteristics. And it's important to understand, for example, the amount of labour that goes into solar cooking is quite high. But in a refugee context, or in an agricultural context, it's not a big deal. You have to go there once every hour or 2 hours to turn the cooker. You have a bunch of kids who are running around playing tag and keeping the goats in check. It's not a big deal for them to look after the cooker too. But if you have to go somewhere else to work and then you come back, what you want is very quick, instant heat that allows you to cook your meal immediately. So you can see that there's some preconditions that are necessary for solar cooking to be, equally convenient to using a stove. The difference between the rocket stove and the wood gasification stove is the rocket stove makes a lot of smoke. With the wood gasification stove, if you're really good at using it, and you get pretty good if you use it every day for a couple of weeks or a month or 2 months, you could cook with almost no smoke, which means you could cook inside. The difference is, if with a wood gasification stove you can have an interior kitchen and you just open a window or you have a small chimney. You can't really do that with a rocket stove. The difference that makes it a winter emergency is with a wood gasification stove you could run the stove in the shelter with no ventilation. Which sounds insane, but once you've gotten pretty good at running the stove, you begin to understand that you could actually do that. And the difference that it makes is 80% of your heat typically goes out through the chimney. So suddenly you can keep your shelter warm on a fifth of the wood that you could otherwise, because you light it outside, you get the stove hot, it goes into the gasification mode, there's no smoke, and you bring it back inside of your shelter and the place is immediately warm. And this is the kind of detail that you need to get if you're going to be teaching people how these systems work. Right? And that means living in them for extended periods, which is not necessarily fun, but that's where you build the hands-on expertise. And one of the things that Lindsay and I are looking at doing in the next year or two is finding some funding and actually having a village with all of this gear somewhere in South America. And, basically people can come for training. You can come and live in the village for as long as you're willing to live in these conditions and rotate around using all of the different systems. And at the end of it, you will become, an expert in distributed infrastructure in a developing world context because you'll have done it yourself. And that's really important. The reason that this stuff looks so different from the refugee stuff that people are typically given is because when I designed the system, I designed it for myself. The Hexier and the infrastructure package and all the rest of that stuff is something that I designed for me to live in for 2 years at a time as a baseline for asking anybody else to live in. And TIDES as a whole really has to try and stick close to that.
Vinay,
Aye.
question. Paul here.
Yes.
It's a fascinating concept, and I know that Lynn is working with government and getting funding to allow you to do something like that, at least in a small scale way. But what kind of materials would you use for your yurts?
Well,
Given that the insulation board is not available in South and Central America, or would you want to ship in some insulation boards, or would you look for something else?
I think
Some kind of an R value.
I think the best way of doing this stuff for South America is probably cardboard and tinfoil. So you start with an industrial cardboard and you layer it, probably, you want triple wall, but you can also get it up to maybe 5 or 6 layers thick. And then you put literally tinfoil, ordinary baking foil, in layered sheets on the outside using wallpaper paste. So you actually get a roll of thick baking foil and you shingle it onto the outside of your building.
That's to reflect the heat of the sun.
Yeah, exactly. Because, the heat of the sun is, something like 1,000 watts per square meter. So you either need very big, thick, heavy walls, or you need to reflect the sun away. Because that turns out to be a lot of heat,
How would you say the best way to attach these foil is?
I think wallpaper paste. And there are some questions about waterproofing, but I think that you can potentially have like a layer of paint and then put the wallpaper paste on top of it. This is the kind of stuff that's going to take experiment. When we talk about local materials, the correct level of resolution for the local materials is nearest industrial city. You want to be thinking about what they have in the big city rather than what you can find in the immediate village. And most big cities will have some capability to do cardboard on a pretty industrial scale. Some of them will have building materials like this press board stuff. But usually the local industrial base makes some kind of durable sheet goods. And then from there you've got to do this sort of math of looking at the local climate and looking at what you can do in terms of surfaces and what you can do in terms of boards and how you can anchor it. That part is very much art, not science yet, unfortunately. Does that answer your question at all, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, much as I would like to be able to ship the insulation boards, not the ones from Home Depot, but the heavy-duty ones all over the world, it's not happening, It's a wonderful material, but at the end of the day, Dow is just not helping us here, and that's their loss.
Well, I know when I met Justin out in San Diego, and he and you, I guess, are experimenting with some other materials that could be fabricated, like this kind of like a corrugated aluminum. It looked like cardboard, but it was, I think, aluminum or some kind of metal.
Yeah, it's about 3 centimeters thick, right? But just over an inch thick, kind of silver on both sides.
It's actually quite a bit thinner than that. Yeah, about a quarter of an inch.
I don't know. I wonder what that was. That must have been one of the samples from the American company.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's what they were.
Yeah.
At any rate.
I mean, there are Oh, go ahead, Paul.
So, I mean, it may be conceivable that someone would come up with some new composition or some new material that would lend itself very nicely to prefabricated, preformed hexier materials that could be shipped or pre-positioned, stockpiled, put in place in high-risk areas.
Oh yes.
Relatively low cost.
Yes, I mean within the packaging industry, they have a lot of this fairly cheap honeycomb cardboard, maybe $7 to $10 a sheet, and it's kind of bulky. I mean, it's a good inch and a half, 2 inches thick, but it's incredibly strong, and if you waterproof it effectively, it could easily last 10 or 20 years. They used to build houses out of a very similar material in California, and they were real houses. They were durable for years and years and years. But for a disaster relief,
I know what you're talking about.
but for disaster relief, I mean, there's this big gulf between pre-positioning and fabricating stuff in an emergency, and Justin's company is very much looking at the pre-position market, and I think it's a very good business to be in. But realistically, for Southcom's needs particularly, they're probably more likely to want to figure out who in South America has the manufacturing capability, and then make some kind of agreement that in the event of a disaster, they'll get materials quickly. That kind of an approach. And I don't think that would be very expensive for Southcom to set up, I mean, it's basically, somebody who speaks, Spanish and Portuguese sitting down with a telephone for a couple of months, figuring out exactly who's got which capabilities in which countries, and then negotiating a bunch of, purchase contracts that say, okay, how much will it cost us for 20,000 shelters worth of materials on a 10-day basis? And then if it happened, you turn the handle. And I mean, I think that there's also a need to do that for Northcom, in terms of, the mass evac paper. Have you guys read that?
What is it?
The paper about using hexyerts in a nuclear context in America. Ah, okay. I'll send you guys a link to that. So, I mean, basically the situation is that, as far as I can tell, we use about 4 billion board feet of that insulation board material a year in America, which is a lot. I mean, it's 500 million boards a year, just over 1 million boards a day. Which gives you the ability to build something like 100,000 or 120,000 hexyerts per day from the material that's already in the supply chain. So that's enough for 600,000 people. And then on top of that, you add the fact that there's probably somewhere between 3 days and 3 weeks of that material in warehouses and in the supply chain. And that means you get a kickstart of somewhere between 1.8 and maybe as many as 20 million people's worth of shelter. So in an emergency context, somebody blows up Boston, and immediately Home Depot and Lowe's and Dow all begin to send as much of that material as they can lay their hands on to the area that's just outside the disaster area. And you teach people to cut boards in half with craft knives and take them into hex yards. And then basically, you've got guys with Geiger counters, showers, and piles of clean clothing who figure out, which category of radioactive you're in, decontaminate you, and then, give you fresh clothing so you're not carrying the radiation with you. And at this point, at least according to the Red Cross and the guys that I've talked to at FEMA, that is the state-of-the-art plan for rehousing people after a nuclear event in America. People have danced around the little jigs and said, oh my god, this is so much better than what we have already. I don't know if that's true or not, because it's not like I have a clearance. But, that's the nuclear response plan. And that's been online for, a year and a half. That's the domestic scenario. And then alongside of that, you need to figure out what to do about infrastructure. The simple plan is that you basically have a national reserve of people who say, in the event of a disaster that displaces a lot of people, you guys can put a hex yard in my backyard and I'll run a power cable out to it and let them use my toilet. So what that gives you is the ability to take these hex yards and piggyback them off the existing infrastructure oversupply. We get so much infrastructure in the cities, and particularly in the suburbs, that if you had a national response register like that, you could easily absorb 10 or 20 million people without even trying. And then over the next, 6 weeks or something like that, you rapidly resettle them into regular housing again. Theoretically, you could do the same thing if you had a national register of all the empty apartments. Practically speaking, that seems to be a lot harder to get people invested in doing, and I don't really understand why that is. But, that would be the more rational approach. So, in the event that you don't want to distribute these folks into the population, then you've got to provide infrastructure for them as well. And if you're dealing with providing infrastructure for millions of people from a standing start, there's no way you could do that without doing things like stockpiling stoves and solar cookers and all the rest of that stuff. And again, $50 to $100 per head, 10 million people that you want to build a reserve for, it's a few $100 million. It's not really a lot of money. Same if you want to stockpile 6-inch tape. It's just not really a lot of money. But it hasn't been done, and there's, as far as we know, nothing directly parallel which has been done. So that's an area that, again, it's worthy of some work. That might be something that NDU wants to crunch actual numbers on and produce a fairly detailed, well thought out, rational plan. And there are some guys in Georgia that I'm talking to at Center for Public Health and Mass Destruction Defense at I want to say University of Georgia, that might be worth talking to about that. Alright, so I think I'm done. I don't have anything else on the top of my head. I need to get you some links on how to make tape anchors, and just some links to some of the other Hexyard construction videos so you can check that stuff out. And maybe we'll have another wee talk about that once you've had a chance to watch the videos. Questions, suggestions? Yeah. I mean, I think watching the videos and then going over it in detail would be a good idea.
Can you please send along the reference on that brittle power 1982 document that you alluded to?
I will. Is somebody taking a note of all the things that I'm supposed to be sending people? Could somebody do that? Okay. So, tape anchors, brittle power, the nuclear response plan. Let's see, what else is there? Oh, the pandemic flu paper, I'll send you guys a link to as well. It's even more cheerful than the nuclear response plan. Just call me Dr. Doom. All right. Okay. Oh, you're very welcome. There is one thing I just want to briefly touch on, something I didn't mention. The other thing is that we got roughly 4 billion poor people. You know, I mean, 3 billion. We have roughly 4 billion poor people. 3 billion of whom are living on less than $5 a day. Maybe 2 billion of whom are living on less than $2 a day. So, most of these people are basically in pretty much the same condition that other people would be in after a disaster. You know, particularly the sort of $1 a day, $2 a day people are essentially living in perpetual crisis. So one of the artificial distinctions that's been made by the NGOs is the idea that there's a difference between disaster relief and development aid. But all of this distributed infrastructure bridges that gap. This is fundamentally, if you give people a wood gasification stove, a 10-year build quality Hexier, you know, a solar panel and a little light and a few other bits and pieces, that's development aid. You just gave these people tools which will quarter their infant mortality. I mean, Pat knows this. If you give people, you know, things which give them kids clean water to drink and freeze them from indoor air pollution, you know, their infant mortality drops like a stone. If they're in an environment where they can get their hands on contraception, you just killed their birth rate too. And that's a few dollars per household, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, $100 per household. And this can be done. Do you guys know about Kerala?
Yeah.
So Kerala is an area of South India. It's got an income of about $300 per year average, which means half of the people there are poorer than that. And the life expectancy and infant mortality are within about 5% of the US levels. They live maybe 2 years less than somebody in the US, and their kids die fractionally more often, on something like a 70th of the average income. Now, the trick that they have over there is not distributed infrastructure. What they have is a government which is very, very tightly focused on the basics. But it's incredibly successful, and it shows you what you can do with a very, very small budget if you apply it directly to public health and education as a primary mission. My feeling is that distributed infrastructure gives us leverage on the problem of global poverty without having to have an enormous spend in getting these problems solved. If US DoD actually does the work on figuring out how to do this kind of distributed infrastructure work on these very sparse budgets, and the material is appropriately, you know, managed in terms of not having patents on it that people can't use, or going all the way and putting it into the public domain and open source for information, then you get into a situation where other people can come along and copy that, and that can be how the developed world helps the developing world up. Look, we figured out all of this cool infrastructure stuff. It's under open, you know, conditions. You can all use it, and in environments where you don't have enough GDP per square mile to pay for things like policing, or you don't have enough GDP per square mile to pay for things like a power grid, you can still provide these vital technologies which give you most of the health and welfare benefits of being in the modern world, while you still remain in your village where your family have farmed since the 5th century AD. So that's really the long-term game plan. If we can figure this stuff out for disaster relief without invoking all kinds of expensive, complicated technologies, and the quality of services is high enough that we as Westerners are comfortable living in it for moderately extended periods, then we've come up with a solution which can be basically franchised all across the developing world. You've got clean water to drink, you've got a great little stove, you've got light to read at night, and you've got this thing that looks like a laptop, works like a laptop, and you watch TV on it. Well, what more do you really need? No, I'm pretty serious about that. If you had to work only 3 or 4 hours a day to maintain that lifestyle, I think a lot of us might even choose it. Or at least a lot of me. So that's another angle to this stuff. The disaster relief thing is all very urgent and all that, but at the end of the day, poverty kills an ungodly number of people every year. It's on the order of 20 million. And if we figure this stuff out, we can actually stop that within probably 1 or 2 generations. If there was a serious foreign policy push from the US government, not at a strategic level, but at a political level, at a diplomatic level, we could probably stomp out most of the worst effects of poverty globally in 5 or 10 or 15 years of hard push. And if it wasn't going to be hard push, if we were just going to do the research and not do all the deployment stuff, it's probably no more than 5 or 10 years of research, probably closer to 5, if it was funded at something like $50 or $100 million a year. And you need to spend that money very carefully, right? It would have to be spent on open source development projects rather than on paying universities to do it, because universities are big and slow and kind of expensive. But with a sea of little grants to small companies and independent researchers, and particularly fast-moving and efficient university departments, we could pretty much break the fundamental problems of global poverty inside a generation. And things like the nano solar panels, these very, very cheap solar panels that are coming online. Heard about this? Yeah. So those are significantly cheaper than coal power. They're not on the open market yet, but they're in mass production and they've sold out the first year and a half of supply. So at that point, distributed infrastructure becomes just as efficient as conventional infrastructure. In fact, more efficient because you don't have to pay for the grid. So if you take that and you take wireless internet on $100 laptops and all of the machines which are like that are being copied, or directly to these sort of new cell phone platforms, then you can see that the developing world is about to get electronic communication. It's going to get ICT and it's going to get electricity very, very rapidly. So, there's an argument there for putting the rest of the distributed infrastructure picture together and sending it out on the carrier wave of cheap electricity and cheap ICT. So you get your laptop and the first thing it tells you is, hi, here's a package of data prepared by the American government that tells you how to build a composting toilet, how to purify your water, and where to buy a gasification stove over 85% of the planet Earth. Here's a medical database, here's a few other bits and pieces. By the way, we're very nice people. If you see anybody out there going to cause any trouble for us, please let us know by sending an email to this address. And the tips that pan out, you have some special forces guys go over there and take care of. If you want to talk about winning the war on terror, the core of that is getting all of the guys all over the world who are the eyes and ears to be willing to tell America when there's a problem and to have America be listening. If we fixed global poverty, do you think it would be very easy to get together to do something dreadful to America? Oh no, the Americans are lovely people. Look how they fixed the world. Isn't that fantastic? Look at all the fantastic stuff they developed and gave away. It's the most effective protection against terrorism you can have, particularly in a Muslim context, because in Islam, charity is regarded as being this kind of sacred duty. So if you have this enormous, huge, colossal charitable act on the part of the US, it will become extremely difficult within Islam to justify things like nuclear terrorism. It theologically becomes almost impossible. So, there are very good political reasons for investing in distributed infrastructure research as well, but I'm not sure that America has the kind of wisdom that it would take to lean on that hard enough to turn it into an effective long-term solution. But, if somebody will put me in charge, this is the way we will do things.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we have a couple people who gotta get
Okay, well, wonderful talking to you all.
Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, very welcome. Anytime. And I will send you a bunch of links to videos on Hexyarch construction, and then, let's follow up once you've had a chance to think about your experiences building them, look at the videos of me building them and other people building them and figuring out how, what's different, what's the same, and what you can learn and what we can learn. And then let's do another call, maybe with a couple of small models, one at your end and one at my end, and we can go over the real technical detail. Because I think that you're going to need to make some changes in how the buildings are built to make best use of that thin brown material. Because the thing about that stuff is, it's actually much stronger in terms of its ability to take point loads than the insulation boards are. So you can drill a hole in that stuff and put a cable tie through the hole, and the hole won't just tear out the board. And that means you can use cable ties to reinforce it in some ways, and I think that you might find that approach gives you a very, very strong building out of a fairly a different material. It's not, the tape is not really necessarily the best way of fastening those. You might find that you actually get on better with wire or cable ties, and then the tape is just to be waterproof. And that might be worth doing a little experimenting with.
Now, Vinay, have you been recording on your end, or what have we recorded on our end?
We've got the voice on our end.
Yeah.
All voice?
And I have both voice and video on my end, I believe. Let's cross our fingers that comes out, but I think we might have the entire thing. We'll see when I hit stop whether it worked.
So what's the best approach for preserving that and distributing it so we can go back over this meeting?
Well, at the very least, I should compress it and send it to you. We might also want to put it up on the StarTides website, because that's probably the most comprehensive recorded overview of at least my perspective on the whole StarTides picture.
Okay.
I'm not.
I don't want it to be lost.
Well, I'm actually recording. I have an independent recording on my camera here, at least of the audio. Plus, I've got the software. Plus, you've got the software on your end. So, fingers crossed, at least one of these will work.
Okay.
Yeah, that should be good.
Okay.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you. All right.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.
And please, somebody send me a list of the stuff I'm supposed to send you all.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Take care.